So I recently got into a conversation with an Oxford University biologist about visual representation of data in his research. And most diagrams, he said, are, you can present fairly basically. And I'd really like to challenge this idea through the context of an exhibition at the British Library, in which we're looking at the importance of data visualization to science, both as a tool of discovery as well as communication. Now, it might seem that data visualization infographics are a very contemporary phenomenon, suited to fast-paced lifestyles, our new and wonderful era of big data where we need to ingest and synthesize as much information as possible in a short amount of time. And websites like the Guardian Data Blog visually proliferate. And it might seem in many ways like this is indeed a very contemporary new thing. But in Beautiful Science, we're looking at the visual legacy of this and bringing together classic diagrams from the library's collections together with some of the most interesting and innovative pieces of contemporary scientific research. And so we've got a mixture of both physical objects as well as digital interactives covering fields of public health, weather and climate, and the tree of life. You can see what it looks like here. So seeing as we're in the Natural History Museum today, I thought I'd start with the tree of life. And what we have here is an illustration of ancient Greek idea of the great chain of being, a hierarchical organization of the universe, starting with God up at the top, moving down to man here, and to animals, to the stones beneath our feet. And this really laid the groundwork for later ideas around taxonomies, organization of information and knowledge and life. And we have, of course, a first edition of Darwin's Origin of Species in the exhibition, in which he shows how all of life on Earth is descended from a much greater lineage. And he uses a metaphor, whereas Ernst Haeckel presents it as a very literal tree, albeit a rather 19th century version with man firmly placed at the top of the tree and all of life that brought us into being presented below. Now, these early trees of life were very inference-based. They were based on what we could infer relationships to be, whereas now trees of life are based on data. Here we have what's called a molecular time tree presenting relationships between different species of birds. And presenting all of life on Earth on an A4 sheet of paper would be an absolutely impossible task. And James Rosendale from Imperial came up with an ingenious solution of actually zooming into this data using a fractal-like technology so you can actually interact with the data, explore it, rather than seeing it as something simply static, printed, to be read. This is something that we can actually zoom into. Now, the field of public health was an area where, in the Victorian period, we saw a number of innovations in the ways in which information was presented. And this was enabled by both advances in statistics, availability of information, and so on. And cholera story is an area where this really came into fruition. Here we have John Snow's cholera map, in which he showed that cholera deaths in Soho scattered around a particular pump. And this was important both as a tool of communication as well as a tool of discovery. So he was able to use this map to prove his hypothesis that cholera was a waterborne disease, but he also communicated it. Florence Nightingale was an absolute star when it came to maximizing the visual impact of her data. Here in this diagram, she shows that far more soldiers were dying in the Crimean War due to preventable diseases here in blue than were actually dying due to battlefield wounds in red. And she used this diagram to drive through important reforms in government. She had an agenda to say with this, and it was very political. And we can compare this with the same data presented by David Spiegelhalter in the form of a bar graph, where, it's maybe easier to read in some respects, but it really lacks the visual oomph of Florence Nightingale's diagram, where you can easily compare month to month and really see the impact that these health reforms had. And so what I'd like to say is that the visual representation of scientific data really does matter and can change the world. Thank you very much.
I told you they were going to be good. That was absolutely fabulous.